So, Amy, let me start by asking you, how this project came to you in the first place.
Well, the origin of this project actually dates back to 2015. I got a call from Working Title Productions. They had optioned Rabia's book that she was writing at the time. And, okay, thanks. I never know the distance. So I listened to Serial much later than everybody else, and I just finished it, and I had so many questions still at the time. And I had never made a series before, and it was just, everything kind of seemed exciting and new, and I wanted to dig in deeper to this case. So I jumped in and had this incredible team to work with, and really noticed right away that there was very little archive, very little to work with. So we had to kind of figure out how to structure this into a series and how to follow the case that, unfortunately, there were many delays from the first PCR hearing until, we finished production was about 3.5 years. But we jumped in, and for me, one of the most important things, which kind of bumps into the clip we were going to show next, was how to bring Hay to life. And I had just seen a film, Diary of a Teenage Girl, recently, as well, and I had loved the animations that Sara Gunnarsdottir had so brilliantly put together, and so I reached out to her and kind of started talking to her about how to bring Hay to life, and that was one of the first challenges of many making the series.
Well, hopefully we'll have a chance to see some of that animation in a minute, and a lot of people have seen it from watching the series. But Sara, before we get a look at it, maybe I can just ask you, when Amy came to you with this project, what intrigued you about the project, and and what were your concepts that you discussed with Amy to visualize this material?
I think what was most exciting for me is that I really like using animation as a very emotional medium, and to use it to illustrate and visualize emotional highs and lows in kind of maybe more abstract and poetic way than like in a literal scene with an action. So that was definitely something I was excited about. And it was also interesting that all the material to bring this person to life was through her diary, which was a very strong material and direct.
You had copies of the diary with its handwriting and some of her doodles.
Yeah, and it felt like it's such a direct piece of that person, and not in contrast to just if it had been just people talking about her and remembering her. It's just an actual piece of this person. And I know it was very kind of fragile, and I was a little bit scared of the material because you have to respect a real person and the people around her. But I almost felt like I had her permission, because in the opening of the diary she calls her diary a memoir, and it writes, this diary is open to those whose heart is innocence, and I kind of felt like that was her permission to me, to bring her to life and to remember her.
It was so striking to me in that first episode that she really is brought to life, amen. And Amy, can you talk about the intentionality of that in that episode?
Yeah, well, as Sara was describing her journal, I just am remembering how much time we spent on her journal in the beginning, because, what we had heard about Heyman Lee was typical to most kind of true crime stories. She was the victim of a murder. I mean, we didn't really have a face or a picture of who this woman was, but when we got into her story, she was a really strong high school girl. She was on the lacrosse team. She was not this slight, meek young girl that just would have let anybody kind of take advantage of her. She had a voice. She had dreams. She was very talented. And so we really wanted to make sure that we were not portraying her as a woman that you would see in a fairy tale. We wanted to make her a real woman who looked real and multidimensional, and so we spent a lot of time on that and creating these scenes, and I really hope you can see the prom scene because we spent so much time on it, and it just kind of, it exemplifies like how we wanted to bring Hay to life. You didn't get any invitation yet, right?
You guys are still working on that back there? Yeah,
Okay.
You'll come up and tell me when.
Okay, well then maybe we'll just jump past it.
Well, I think it's important too that in so many crime stories, the victim is sort of a foil to tell a story about a crime, and we didn't want to do that because not only was it very worthwhile knowing who this person really was to feel their loss, I think we all felt that if the question had been asked at the time by the people investigating who was this person, we might not be in the world of confusion that we are today about what happened to her.
Right.
That's an important question to ask. So.
Well, we can circle back to this if we get our projector operational again. I want to talk about some of the other investigation that you did originally for this series. As I was saying in my introduction, you might think, well, what else is there to discover if this case has been so raked over? Can you talk about, and I know there's vast details, so I don't want to get too lost in the details, but if you could just, kind of hit some of the points that were key on your mind to try to dig into.
Well, okay, from the beginning, I knew everybody I spoke to when I would tell them that I was going to make this film, they all wanted to know who did it. That's always the first question in any kind of true crime, but especially in this case because it was so mysterious. So I think at least Ruchi and I made this decision from the beginning to really look at why instead of who. And we had some investigators helping us look into alternate scenarios, but the psychology of why everybody fell for this kind of ludicrous scenario that the state put forward became more interesting to us, and that's something that I think only a film can tell, because you need to see the environment and feel kind of the homes of the families affected and see where they went to high school, and so that's kind of where we started. And Ruchi actually grew up in Baltimore, so she was a great resource in terms of like the intersection, the melting pot as they call it. So we spent a lot of time on the psychology of it, and maybe you can talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that we, I did this case was so close to home for me because I'm actually the same age as Adnan and Hay, grew up 10 minutes away. We hung out at the same diners. I played a basketball game at their house, at their school, at their house. And so it felt close, especially when I listened to the podcast and I heard about, I heard that Hay was just cheerful and happy, and I thought, well, that's not the whole story of a high school girl. And then also when I heard, I think the podcast in some ways wrote off the idea that there could have been any racism involved in the case. And when I read that Adnan had been portrayed as having this double life, my first thought was, well, what teenager doesn't? But also as a child of immigrants, like I know that you have a double life so that you can do what you want without hurting your parents. And that's what I saw in his story as well. So I think that was part of the psychology that brought us into it. And I also think that, we learned pretty quickly that it's important to ask the right questions because you're going to get the answer to the question that you ask. And so by asking, how did these things happen instead of who done it, I think that's what oriented our investigation into, the original investigation the police did. They asked, did Adnan Syed do this? Not who killed him and Lee. Those are very different questions.
And then just to bring Alex into the conversation, because he's such a huge part of the storytelling here, we had early on, besides wanting to use animation to tell Hay's story, I got really into Michel Gondry videos from the 1990s, and I was really into this idea of split screens, and it was such a crazy idea because it wasn't that crazy of an idea once I got Alex, but other editors that I had spoken to did not think it was a great idea. But I wanted to create, a look for the past and a look for the present in our investigation. And he is just such a genius and able to handle so many multiple storylines at once. So we started seeing the archive with our story in split screen, and it really kind of gave this other look that I would love Alex to talk about, because that's one of my favorite parts of the film.
Yeah, sure. So I do, like, just to kind of back up a little bit, I think one of the most interesting things, this is a series, it's a 4-episode series. Amy refers to it as a film, and that's sort of from the jump how we thought of it and talked about it, which is really interesting. And I've worked on other series, and especially nowadays, they tend to be like scheduled really tight and thought of like very episodically, but we really ran ours differently, which I think was a huge asset. We kind of treated it like one giant feature film. I was the lead editor on all 4 episodes, and that really gave us the time and the space to sort of like, I remember when I came on, I came on later than anyone else on the stage, and when I came in, it was really sort of like, let's figure out what this is. Is this 3 episodes? Is it 4 episodes? How do we tell the story in the best way? And that's sort of where we started from, and that also gave us the freedom to really like frame each episode in the way that it needed to be framed to tell what we needed to tell, and I think that also led to like such a rich diversity in the episodes, where it's like the first episode is this like really evocative, like intimate high school story that's bolstered by all of this incredible like an emotional animation. The second episode where the split screen comes in is really where we sort of like dive into the investigation. 3 is in many ways like a courtroom drama, but also like a very personal thing. And episode 4 ends up being like a very verite-driven episode about sort of like the agony of the court system and the toll that it takes. But yeah, and then in terms of the split screen, that was something we introduced in episode 2 in terms of, conversations with Amy and just like how do we, it was a challenging series because the bulk of our archive was audio recordings, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what made it such a great podcast. But then when it came time to tell a visual story, we luckily had a lot of trial footage that we could do, which was really interesting. But then when it came to just telling the nuts and bolts of like Jay's story, for example, we had all these recordings, and it just became Amy knew she wanted to do split screen, and so we just started throwing stuff down in terms of like what are the illustrations that we can use. I was really actually inspired by a previous film Amy had done. All of her previous films, but in particular Prophet's Prey. I remember watching that, and it had, it was about fundamentalist Mormon communities, which are obviously pretty insular and difficult to access. And they did a lot of like really incredible evocative photography of those communities, like cars driving by, and that was like a huge lead for our series as well, was to sort of take that and use it to really like put you in the feel and the place of Baltimore while you were hearing these audio recordings. And Split Screen helped us with that too, to really just kind of like reference all of these different images in a very complicated story and see them all coming up.
I think we have our ability to try this clip again. So we're going to look at clip 2 called Promising, that really highlights Sara's work and shows you how they evoked the presence of Amen. Alex, watching that now after hearing you describe some of your editing challenges and techniques on this, it really made me appreciate just how many different materials you're working with there. You've got Adnan's voice from prison. You've got this actress's voice reading Amen. You've got archival footage. You've got Sara's animation. All these kinds of motion graphics. It looks flawless when we watch it, and I don't even question it the first time I saw it, but just watching it now after listening to you talk, it made me wonder about the whole process of getting to there.
And real quick, I just want to call out the actress actually was an assistant editor on the project, Anne Yao, who came on. She was actually on before my time, but she did all of our temp recordings for the diary, and when it came time to lock them in, we were just like,
can't do that.
Yeah, really.
All the friends said she was the best. Hey.
So again, this was the result of, in many ways, I feel like this was almost one of my easiest jobs, this scene, because I had such a rich variety of materials, and I had Sara's work to lean on, and she was an incredible collaborator in the entire process. By the time I started the edit, they had already been going for a little while, and so she had done a lot of early draft animations that I had access to from the start, as well as like the diary pages and the photos. And so that was the starting place. In the edit, we would just sort of like play with these different ideas that she had created, and then when we got that to a place where we were like, okay, this is working, this is good. In some cases, it was ideas she'd created. In some cases, it was sort of like putting up slates that said this is sort of what we're thinking here. And that led us to like a pass that we were all happy with, at which time we turned it over to Sara, and she really like worked her magic on everything. And I think if you want to talk about that a little bit more from your end.
I think by the time you came in, we had a lot of ideas and really rough drawings, but I was kind of starting to really animate the project by the time, or a little bit after we came on. And now I can't remember, but I think...
So let me ask you this. Does everything you do go into the film? I have to imagine that your work is labor intensive. I hope you're charging a boatload for it. And I'm not going to budget. So, I imagine when, whether it's Amy or any other director, they're trying to give you direction that they're not going to have to redo later. But is there a lot of drafts?
Well, it's particularly tricky in a documentary, and especially something like this, where the case is still active and it's just changing and evolving, until it's ready. But fortunately, everything I was doing was in the past, so it wasn't that much affected by the case that's happening today. But there was one scene in particular that we did go through a lot of different approaches, and that was the sexual assault scene that we decided we're probably not going to show today, but we actually did quite a bit of animation for that Anne did cut out. But fortunately, everything else was just kind of solid enough. The idea was solid enough that even if it was moving around in the edit, we kept it as it was.
We had a pretty tight script for episode 1 from the beginning, and there were a couple of scenes that we weren't sure if they would make it into the cut, so I think we pushed those down, and we spent more time on the other scenes, and then once we kind of realized that we were just going to keep the animations in episode 1 and freed our budget up to be a little more fluid, but if we did numerous drafts of the sexual assault scene and had numerous conversations over whether or not to include that scene in the film. But Sara she just got it so many times on the first time. It's just, she really understood Hay because she spent so much time with the research and talking to us that I think it was a pretty smooth process.
It actually was.
So let's jump ahead to talking about some of the investigation. We've got a clip of Krista talking. Do you want to? Christy. Do you want to just set up who Christy was and?
Okay, so Christy in the podcast was not her real name, Kathy, and she was a friend of Jen. She was a sorority sister of Jen Pusateri, and I kind of cold called her one day, and I was surprised how receptive she was actually to sitting down and talking to us. The biggest shame about Christy's story is that she had journals and she had written everything down around the time, but because the police and the investigators that she spoke with in the police station had a certain agenda, they never referenced anything, and she had just gotten rid of everything like a year before we called her. So it existed during serial, actually. And she did not understand the rest of the narrative of the story, which we kind of explained a few things to her, and suddenly there were a lot of really interesting shifts. And I think let's show the scene first and then talk about those afterwards.
So this is clip number 4 titled, clip number 5 titled Christy.
Something that's just so, like a secondary storyline for Christy is that she remembers Adnan being really high at her house one night, not the 13th, and she remembers getting an impression of him. And her whole testimony and her whole feeling that he did this is based on a night when he and Jay came over to her house and were acting strange. And so it's just an interesting case of memory planting, basically, because once she formulated this story, she can't let go of the fact that she thinks he did it, even though it's probably not based on the same date. So we were really kind of, we were baffled by all the conversations we have with her. She really wants to remember something differently, but she just can't get around her kind of prejudice about him.
Amy, I'm curious, when you began this project, did you begin with a belief that Adnan Syed was not the killer of Hay Min, or was that still an open question in your mind?
It was very open. The thing that struck me the most about the podcast was Jay. I was just so frustrated with him, and I couldn't understand why his story kept changing. And when I started looking into all the illogical statements and beliefs that everyone held on to, I really just wanted to understand Jay. And he remains an anomaly. I've spoken to him numerous times, and we have another scene where Jay changed his story again when we spoke to him. But if you take Jay's story out of the mix and you look at kind of the evidence, which we looked at in this film, there was DNA tested while we were making this film, nothing connects to it. No, the fingerprints on, that were submitted at the trial don't match Jay or Adnan. So
And just to state the obvious in case anyone doesn't remember this, Jay is the person whose testimony is some of the most devastating to convict Adnan Syed.
yeah, Jay was the accomplice essentially, and
In the state story.
In the state story, and so there's no fingerprints, nothing matches their story. So, so that's where we went with it. That was our investigation, and so we focused a lot on Jen and Christy and other friends of Jay's who, painted a pretty dark picture of him. So yeah, that's when I.
Should we look at the clip called? This is clip number 6. Jay changes.
Well, before we play it,
Yes.
let's just talk about what Jay had said before. That Jay had, in his trial 1 and 2, Jay had said that he had picked up and he saw the body and picked up Adnan at Best Buy. Just to tee that up.
Amy, during the time that you're doing this investigation, there is, Adnan's case is moving through the courts in a slow way. Can you talk about what was happening in the backdrop as you were making the series?
In the legal process.
Yeah.
Well, we started filming in the spring of 2016 at the PCR hearing, which I think it took 9 months to get the ruling on that. It was a really late summer. Okay, 6 months later. Okay, so the basis of the PCR was, which is post-conviction relief, was Asia's alibi testimony and the cell phone pings. And 6 months after all of this evidence was presented, Adnan wins. He's supposed to get a new trial. His conviction is overturned. It's a happy day. So we had this idea that we were going to be documenting kind of a new trial, potentially a release, or maybe it would never get to trial. So then the state appeals that, and we documented the appeals hearing, which again focused on those issues, but focused more heavily on the cell phone towers at that point. And that was another long.
It was like another 8 or 9 months.
8 or 9 months, yeah. So 8 or 9 months later, they win again. But this time when they win, these justices had spent so much time going through the entire case, and it was just a win on every level. They said that the state failed to prove their case, that they can't even see a scenario where Adnan would have been the murderer, or he would have even had access to it. I mean, it was a very damning ruling, and so then the state appeals it again, and so then there was what you would consider a formality after 5 justices have ruled in his favor. They go to the highest court in Baltimore, in Maryland, the Court of Appeals, and this is where this very interesting technicality is presented by the state, where they say that if Asia had testified in the original trial, that they would have changed the scenarios that could have happened, which is actually something that's unheard of in Baltimore. You can't just change your timeline and your theory of what happened in the case, and they won. They won on that basis. So right now the Supreme Court is hearing whether or not that should be their premise, but it's really strange if you think about it. So that's where we are right now, is that he's waiting until, I think November 25th, we'll know if he gets heard by the Supreme Court.
Since we're talking about documentary series today, you were describing to me before the panel that the full timeline on this project was 3.5 years, which you were saying to me is unusual amongst your other colleagues who often are working on projects with a quicker turnaround time.
Well, this is where I think you have to credit HBO, because we went in and we sold this in the room with no deck, nothing. It was just an idea, which doesn't really happen too much anymore, except maybe at HBO because they're so filmmaker friendly. And they allowed us to put the brakes on after a year because the delays were affecting our schedule. We would have never been able to deliver. And at that time, Sheila was leaving and Sarah was going to Imagine, so we started working with Nancy and Lisa, and they just gave us what we needed to get to the end. But just taking the pressure off for a year allowed us to be documentary filmmakers and just investigate and not worry about a ticking clock with the budget and all that, and that really helped.
So can you get into that a little bit more about what it meant to put the project on pause for a year? I mean, you've got a crew who's working with you on their salaries, and then did you know because of the pace in the case we're going to take off for a year, or were you saying, well, we're going to take off for some time and see what happens 2 months? How did that work?
Well, I took another film to keep everyone going, and Ruchi and I just stayed on this anytime anything would happen. We were down there. We kept investigating. I mean, I obviously just get paid for the project, so I can work on it as long as I need to. And so it was more about keeping my team in place, and things were happening, randomly, and we were just able to cover them without having to have a 10-person team fully, covered by the budget of the project.
And then at some point
we brought Alex in, we brought Alex in like 9 months later, and he looked at what we had cut before and everything we had, and we just started piecing the story back together because there were things happening at that time.
You described that you were thinking of this as just a film, not so much thinking about series and episodes, but at some point, do you have to adapt that thinking to breaking it up into 4 parts that are going to, initially be shown a week apart?
Well, we were shooting it like a film. We knew. I mean, we had 4 outlines. We had a script for episode 1, and then we had outlines for all the other episodes, and then you have to work within a certain framework to make a series. But we thought about it like a film. We wanted it to be very cinematic. We wanted to shoot it in the way that we would shoot a film. But we did, have conversations about act breaks or episodic breaks, as we call them now. But it was new for me because I had never done it before. So it was just like I just brought everything that I had from feature filmmaking into this, and I wanted it to look that way. I didn't want to kind of change anything just because it was episodic.
So a lot of what we've seen so far has been the way the series looks at things that have happened in the past. We do have this clip called Adnan in Prison, where you're interviewing his mother, that really reflects another layer to the series, where you're covering what's happening in real time almost.
Right, so right before this scene was shot, we were the most emotional, I have like 2 most emotional days in my filmmaking career, and this is the second one for sure. We were sitting in the living room of Rabia's house, and Shamim, Adnan's mom, while the camera's rolling, admits that she has leukemia, and it's just devastating. And she hadn't been getting treatment. It was just incredibly emotional. So knowing that, I think we can tee up the.
Okay, so we're going to look at clip number 8, titled Adnan in Prison. Let me just ask you one question before we do that, because we're, anyone who's followed this case on the podcast or in the series is become so accustomed to hearing Adnan's voice and his, eloquence and his humor just by being in prison. And maybe it's deceptive because all we hear are these calls. We don't see the process behind getting him on the phone. And I wonder if you can talk about that. What did it take to get these interviews with Adnan? How many hours did you record with him?
Oh my Alex? I don't know.
Hundreds.
I think, yeah. But I mean, by the time I had started, you had been, again, speaking to him for years. So, I mean, like especially at the beginning of the project, there were just months where there would be a call every other day, and they would all be, you know, I think
An hour.
An hour.
Yeah, 30 minutes, and then he would have to hang up and then call me again. There was another guy in the prison that wasn't using his phone privileges, so he gave them to Adnan. So I would get one call from Adnan Syed, and the next one was from like Will Reed or something. And then unfortunately he passed away while he was in prison, and we were down to 30-minute calls. But I spoke to him a few times a week for at least 3 years, so maybe more than that. So yeah. It's a lot.
So this final clip talks about the efforts of Adnan's lawyers to be working out a plea deal.
Right.
Is there anything you want to say to set up?
Yeah, because at this point, we were waiting for the Court of Appeals, which was the negative ruling that we got the Friday before our series aired on HBO. And
So that was, I couldn't remember the sequence.
Yeah.
So before episode 1 aired.
like there's a 6 p.m. press release, which is a little bit strange as well. But anyhow, sorry.
We're just setting up this plea deal.
Oh, right. Yeah, so the state was of the idea that they were going to lose again. And they had tested the DNA. Nothing came back with Adnan on it. And then they were negotiating with his attorney. So there was this idea that maybe he would get like an offered plea or something positive. So you'll see what happens here.
Okay, so the final clip 9 title plea deal.
So right after this, Adnan did turn the plea deal down, and then the Court of Appeals denied his new trial. So it's a really sad ending, and we're still kind of in it.
And a 4-3 decision, so it was just one judge made the difference.
So this decision happens a few days before your first episode is going to air. How much did you have to, do on the 4th episode that was coming 3 weeks later to get it in shape?
A lot. We were pretty much in post up to about a week before the episode aired. It was pretty heavy. We were changing things and adding things.
I mean, can you put a percentage on episode 4 of how much of it was shot?
It turned out to be about 2 extra minutes, maybe, and just a little bit of cutting, because we also had a time limit on that episode that was pretty stringent. And it was hard to, but we were like actively investigating. We got calls from people, and there was a witness came out who had not spoken before. We had been trying to get in touch with this person who worked with Don Kleindienst at Lens Crafters, and he had this memory of Don at work with scratches all over his arms while his girlfriend had just gone missing like a couple days later. And so Heyman Lee was dating a guy named Don Kleindienst at Lens Crafters where they worked. So that came out, and we had to add the appeal in, and it was really traumatic, I think, for everyone.
Yeah, this is something that I think was really interesting about this series, because it was certainly the first thing I'd ever worked on that was so high profile, and I feel like for a long time, the case moved so slowly. We had like 6 months of waiting, 9 months of waiting for a decision, and then all of a sudden, of course, and this does happen on a lot of things, the last 2 months, everything's changing all the time, and so with this was like a double-fold thing of I remember when we got the news the week before the first episode aired, I was actually doing a conform review of episode 4 and watching these scenes where Adnan decides not to take the plea and just feeling so gut-wrenched by how horrible it all was, knowing that was how it was going to end. And then as Amy said, after the first episode aired, so we had 4 weeks, 4 episodes, 4 weeks, the first episode aired, and then all of a sudden, everything's back in the public eye, people are coming out, people are having new memories, people are saying things, people that they had been trying to get in touch with for years all of a sudden want to talk. And so we actually ended up, I think already delivered the 4th episode, or we were mixed and colored and ready to go, and And then Amy got all these leads, and she was like, "We have to go back in. We have to add this information." And it ended up being a really good thing. It was tough. And also, HBO was so wonderful on our 4 episodes, 1 through 3. They were like, whatever feels right for the story is your runtime. Of course, 4 was the one where they were like, you need it to be under 60. And we had got it just there, and then we were like, but we have to add all this stuff. And we're 2 weeks before. I think I did a shift, and then I was unavailable, so Ruchi went in with another one of our very talented editors, Ali, and did the shift as well, working with Amy to get these last couple scenes in shape. Kind of the week before it was
it was so
stressful.
Yeah, it was a miracle that we delivered that properly, because we had also color and sound to deal with, and they, operate independently. And Alex was on another job, so we were like doing weekend shifts for that. It was crazy, but the adrenaline was really pumping at that point. We were going crazy.
We've got about 10 minutes. I'd like to open the audience for questions. The first hand I see up is on the aisle there. Stand up and speak loudly as you can.
Hi. Thank you so much. I mean, this is just a very powerful series, and I think The Friend speaks about like the things that a lot of people forget. It's like this is about people who are innocent in jail, and also about the victim. I'm curious about. There's the business side of delivering to HBO, and then there's the artistic integrity where you're sitting down and someone tells you they have leukemia on camera. With Heyman and her family, they're not, you have archival footage. How much were you trying to get anyone from them to speak to you? And how do you feel about trying to, I guess, share with others her story when you've beautifully put her journals to life, but you can't hear from her again?
Right.
So the question for anyone who didn't hear it is about covering the story of Hayden Lee and her family.
Well, okay, so we spent the first year and a half trying to get in touch with them. We got very close a couple times. We hired a Korean producer to go and speak with the family. We found a family friend through some people in the Korean Business Association down in Maryland, and she spoke on the record very eloquently about what was going on in the house at the time. And a high school girl, I would say 90% of their life is their friends anyway. So we spent so much time making sure that we accurately covered Heyman Lee through her friends and those she knew so well. And we were obviously very fortunate to have the journal, because you can't dispute her own words. But it was always important for all of us to keep Hay's memory alive throughout the entire series, and to remember that an innocent life was lost, in this awful story.
Right, next question. Where do you come from?
Hi, Christina.
Yeah.
I'm from Baltimore too, so the story's close to my heart. I just wanted to know, I bet there were a lot of documentarians that wanted to cover this topic, and I was wondering how you gained access to these people when they were probably already pretty media fatigued.
So great question. She's wondering how you dealt with people in this film after they may have been very media fatigued from all the other journalists trying to talk to them.
Sure. Well, it was difficult, actually, because so many of the people, when we reached out to them, like you said, had been contacted, had been harassed, had people leaving notes on their doors and messages on their phones. So it was difficult, but I think, and it took 2 years for Asia, for example, to agree. But in the end, she felt like, because we had worked on this for such a long time, she had heard from other people that what our approach was. Amy has a long track record of making films that, speak truth to power. So it was more difficult, and there were some people that did not speak to us that we really wish had, like Stephanie McPherson, for example. It would have been a really important one. We tried really hard, but I think at the end of the day, it was just the respectfulness and the persistence, and it became clear what we were trying to do was not sensational. So.
One of the most challenging interviews that we did, which we did twice, was Jennifer Piscateri, who has been so,
She was a friend of Jay's.
Yeah. I was just assuming everybody knows all these characters. So Jen's life has just gone down a really dark path because of her relationship with Jay, and she did not participate in Serial, and she was, she had really important information, and I think one day we might hear something different from Jen. She shared a lot with us, but her life has never recovered from being a friend of Jay's and being involved in this case, so that was a tough one. And it would have been great to speak with Stephanie. Like Ruchi said, we tried so many times. We left notes, I got the door slammed on my face, just a lot of outreach. We just always thought that this woman who was such good friends with Adnan and Jay would have something really important to say, and she does know something because she was spending the next 6 weeks before Adnan got arrested, she was with him exclusively, even though she supposedly knew that he murdered a friend of theirs. So we always thought that she was the most important part of the story, and hopefully one day there will be a subpoena that she can't, avoid, or a conversation that she'll have with somebody.
Do you feel like you have another chapter of the story to tell, or do you feel like you've done what you can do on this story and maybe it's for someone else to tell another chapter?
Well, I see Nancy Abraham in the audience. If there is a hearing, if the Supreme Court hears this case, I would assume that we would cover that. It's an election year, who knows, maybe something will change if Brian Frosch does not win, or if he does win, or who knows what will happen next. But we have our finger on it all the time. I talk to Justin and Rabia very regularly, and we're all hoping for something good to happen on it. All everyone wants is a new trial. It's not like he should just be let out of prison. It should be an actual proper trial where evidence will be presented, and I think that would just tell, a much better story than what has been out there so far.
All right, question right here.
So, I was just kind of wondering, some of that stuff that was shown was pretty revealing about the discrepancies of what people said that day, and then like what happened, and it's publicly broadcast. Can that stuff also be used to like push towards that trial? And then is there like public pressure on these people now because of the film, like kind of like with When They See Us, how that was so instrumental in pushing that needle forward? Have you been able to see that with this as well?
So she's asking, after the podcast, after the series, is public pressure help on the legal process, and does the investigative things that you've uncovered make any difference?
Right. Well, if they fail, if they lose in a few weeks, then they would have to kind of start from scratch again. And until about a month ago, accomplices in Maryland their statements had to be corroborated, and we have shown that Jay's corroborations are faulty, at least. So I think that the Christy Vinson story and the discrepancies in Jay's story, as well as Jen, could potentially be another avenue legally. I'm not a lawyer, but I would assume they could take that path. Hopefully, I mean,
Can they use that in the trial? Like
it would be, the PCR hearing was March or February of 2016, and so that process took 3 years. So I mean, that's how long they're looking at to open up a new investigation within the Supreme Court. And I don't actually even remember how long they waited before they actually got that hearing. So it's probably another 5 years if they don't win right now. And hopefully I'm wrong, but that's what it kind of seems like.
I just want to call attention to one sort of more macro thing about the film, well, two things about the film moving the needle in sort of macro senses. One is that Maryland courts have a very archaic policy in which no court proceedings can be broadcast at all in any capacity, which policy we obviously violated, and I think they threatened to hold us in the
They threatened to sue us, after the first episode,
I think we all kind of hoped, working up against that this film could possibly try to move the needle on that a little bit, because it's literally like it's a court of law that should be open to the public, and it's ridiculous that those proceedings are kept under lock and key. And then on a slightly more micro level, if you've seen episode 4, we heavily feature a very unscrupulous man named Rabia Chaudry, who has prosecuted Adnan's case with great
zeal.
Great zeal and very little professionalism, and is now running for mayor of Baltimore. So especially if you do have connections to Baltimore, I do as well. I would encourage everyone to really get out get out the word about the room. Maybe watch episode 4 before you vote in this next mayoral election.
That's right.
All right, we have time for one or two more questions right there.
Hi there. Meg, Amy, you talked about how you'd only done features before, and this was your first docu-series, and then you touched a little bit about how you guys thought about, essentially I was hoping you could talk a bit more about your story editing process for a docu-series. You talked about episodic breaks a little bit, but I was hoping you could expand on that a little bit.
Well,
The question I did here was just to talk a little bit more about the episodic nature of this.
Yes. Okay, so I've done a couple series since this, so I feel like I have a little more experience in it, but I would never do, the only thing I would do differently is I wouldn't have opened our edit up. There was a schedule where we had to start editing on a certain date with this production company we were working with, and that was just a waste of money and time, because we didn't have any footage and we had to still explore so much of the story. But I wouldn't do anything differently, because you just immerse yourself in the story and you find the breaks, you find the most emotional moments. And I like to write a lot. I like to write outlines and ideas and loose scripts. And I feel like the more you just keep writing and writing and seeing things in front of you, you can collaborate better with your editor, because you know what you saw on set, and you know what you saw in the picture, and you know like what's going to work. But it's just, I think every show is probably different. So I think that with a major premium series, I think that how things are going to end and how the next episode is going to begin is really the most kind of, that's a question that you'll get a lot as a filmmaker. So I think knowing how to keep people interested to tune in again the next week is kind of the only tip I would have if you're asking for tips, because everything else is just, it's just about being organic and true to the story.
And I think we did. I think we started with a framework of what those moments would be, and a lot of times fleshed them out in the edit, which was just another, like I said at the beginning, about having a lot more freedom on this series to really, on a typical series schedule, you're so crunched, you really have to. You don't have as much time to play around as we did on this one. So we went into every episode with a structure and a format in mind, and I'd say by and large we ended there, but we certainly did move those places, I think, early on in the process. Again, this is a little inside baseball, but episode 1, we had always structured to end with the beginning of the PCR as sort of our cliffhanger, and very early on we had a screening where it was sort of posed to us, well, what if you hold that off? And then we did, and it sort of changed the way that we framed that and pushed everything back in the other episodes, and it was a great decision. But other moments, like, for example, the cliffhanger between episode 2 and 3, which is the reveal of Keisha, who's Jay's ex-girlfriend, that was something I think that we had on paper, and then when we did it in the edit, we were like, okay, this works, we fleshed it out and really maximized it. But always sort of had a little flexibility to move things around, and then just finding a moment where it's like, oh, that's a great hook. I would tune in next week if I saw that.
Right, and another great challenge we had making the series, when we first started, we reached out to the communications department of the prison, and they had granted us 5 days in the prison with Adnan, crazy access, filming him in the weight room, the kitchen. They were going to let us do everything, and apparently through Raja found out about that 3 days before we got to the prison, and we lost all our access. So that was another big setback in this, film process. Was that, so we had to continue to reimagine the story regularly without him, and just with his voice again, which obviously we found as many beautiful visuals to tell that story, but it was challenging.
We have to wrap this up. As we do, though, I want to highlight 2 things yet to come this week. In our pro day, we have a day devoted to podcasting, including a couple sessions on other great true crime podcasts. The podcast S-Town, that creator Brian Reed will be here on stage with me talking about that series. We also have a day, I think it's the same day, so you might have to choose on Thursday. It's a podcast in one theater, and another theater is a day with lawyers talking about different aspects of legal wrangling around documentaries. There are days ahead on producing and funding
So I hope you get to come back and take it more pro. I also want to reflect in our 10th year at Doc NYC. When I think back to those 10 years, absolutely one of the highlights of the 10 years was showing Amy Berg's An Open Secret. And that was, speaking of legal wranglings, it was like up until a couple days before we showed it, we weren't sure if we were going to be able to show it. And it was, Amy's dedication and persistence that really gave me the courage to hold on and make sure that we could make that happen. Amy was back as one of our centerpiece films a few years ago with her film Janice. So Amy, you've been so important to our festival. I want to thank you. I want to thank you for being here today. This is a series that came out in the winter. It's not like Amy has anything to promote by being here, but I know that the case itself means so much to you, and when we were talking about this, it was just very important for Amy to kind of keep this case alive.
Thank you, and to throw it back to you, you programmed my first film, Deliverance from Evil, at the Toronto Film Festival. Your first year there, so
That's right.
our careers have kind of started at the same time. So anyway, thanks again for having us.